Joining us now to look closer at this report and what it actually calls for. In the studio, Ahmed Ghoneim, a member of the Fatah movement. First, let's go to New York. Ahmed Benchemsi joining us there. He's Advocacy and Communications Director for Human Rights Watch. And I'll go ahead and start with you on this report. It obviously describes widespread abuses against journalists like we just heard described. How high up does it go? Does it start right at the top of the Palestinian Authority or the Hamas leadership?
Well, the security agencies of both sides are implicated in this. I mean, the worst perpetrators are the Mukhabarat, the intelligence services on the Fatah and West Bank side, and the internal security on the Gaza side. Yeah, we have sent letters to both to agencies in both sides and received detailed answers. But even though they recognize what they call individual cases or isolated cases, they deny systematic abuse, which is in contradiction with the findings of our report.
Well, I want to ask Ahmed Ghoneim, as disturbing as the report is, as we just heard, a complete denial, not even grappling with some of the issues raised. How plausible is that complete denial, Ahmed?
Look, in spite of the comments and condemns in the report related to the part of the actions of the Palestinian National Authority and Hamas, we are respecting and accepting the report. It's a professional report clarifying the discrimination policies from the Israeli side against the Palestinians for the favor of the settlement and settlers in West Bank, clarifying the continuous aggression and the closure
but that's a different
Gaza.
Subject. We're talking about the way the Palestinians...
It's the same report. It's the same report. The same report are talking about all sides. The Palestinians, Hamas, and the Palestinian National Authority, and talking about Israel.
I understand.
The main topics of the reports is against Israel. It's not against the Palestinians.
Hold on. Let's pause there. Ahmed Benchemsi, clarify for us, is the main topic of this report Israel, as Ahmed here in the studio says?
I'm afraid it is not the main topic of this report, even though we have documented continued violations by the Israeli state in Gaza and the West Bank for decades. But it so happens that this report is focused on violations committed by both the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza.
I'm not sure if you heard him well there, Ahmed. He's saying that that is not the focus of this particular report. It is focused on the West Bank and Gaza specifically. I want to ask you, number one in their recommendations in Human Rights Watch is for Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to publicly pledge to end arbitrary arrest, torture, and impunity by security forces. Is that something you can see President Abbas doing?
Look, from a principal point of view, I'm respecting the report and the human rights, the calling for respecting the human rights in general, including this report. I believe that President Abbas will learn the report, and our official people will study the report and try to respond, and I believe that they will respect it.
I want to go, Ahmed Benchemsi, I want to just go back to you on this. On what we're talking about here, sort of an occasional stepping over the line, or are we seeing a culture, especially within the Palestinian Security Services in the West Bank, a sort of culture that enables the security services to act this way with impunity?
Well, yes, you said it right. The accountability is extremely limited. I mean, we have seen very few cases of people being interrogated and investigated over this, and no indictment as far as we know. I mean, yes, unlike what the security services told us about individual cases being investigated and the perpetrators are held accountable, we believe that the practice of arbitrary arrest and torture has become institutionalized both in the West Bank and in Gaza.
I want to follow up with you on that, on the process of carrying out this report itself, because the heart of the report is about the difficulty of being a journalist and reporting on the facts or on the governments in the West Bank or Gaza. How difficult was it for Human Rights Watch to actually carry out the investigations in this report, to get people to talk?
Well, I mean, we've been working on this report for about 2 years, so we had time to collect a lot of interviews. We interviewed 147 persons specifically, including former detainees, including lawyers, including workers of rights organizations, including people who had access to detention centers. And it seems that it's not just journalists. I mean, things have worsened lately because usually, like, the typical victim of such abuses would be a member of the other side, like the Hamas authorities would crack down on sympathizers or members of Fatah and vice versa. But lately, we've seen also an increase of arrests, arbitrary arrests and torture of journalists and even like regular citizens who just comment their disagreement with the authorities of the place they live in on Facebook.
Ahmed Ghoneim, we just heard arbitrary arrest and torture of Palestinian journalists by Palestinian Security Forces in the West Bank. Don't those kind of charges undermine the Palestinian struggle against Israel that they say they are waging for their rights?
There are no comparison between what the Israeli side are doing for the Palestinian and that what we are doing. There are many mistakes are happening in the Palestinian territory, and I believe that's always we are calling the security services to stop arresting journalists and to take any action against them. Free speech and human rights is a very important thing for all the people. Personally, I wrote many articles supporting the free speech in Palestine in specific and in the world in general. This is a principle which is supposed to be respected from the Palestinian government and the Palestinian National Authority and from Hamas, which authorized in focus in the ground. I am calling for studying the cases individually and trying to solve all the problems. It will be difficult to discuss the issue without hearing your guest from Washington, because I need to understand what he said.
And I realize, unfortunately, you don't have that audio at this point. The report, though, and as we heard in the report preceding this, is very clear in terms of the systematic abuse, random arrests, detention and torture of journalists, both in the West Bank and Gaza. Do you think, I mean, recently you've been here in the studio talking about Mahmoud Abbas being under pressure, about a relatively difficult time for the Palestinian Authority. Can you see this trend potentially increasing as Mahmoud Abbas is in a tight spot in his leadership?
No, abusing journalists and putting some obstacles in front of free speech is not policy in the Palestinian National Authority. The law is calling for respecting the free speech and protecting the journalists in Palestine. There are some acts happening here or there, and it's clearly not policy. You can't compare with we can't compare between the Israeli policy against the Palestinian journalists, preventing the Palestinian journalists from attending the press conference of the Prime Minister in his office, as example, Israeli press conference in Israel, while President Abbas is receiving the Israeli journalists in his office and doing
as Ahmed says, Israel is not the focus of this particular report.
Well, I do want to go back to Ahmed Benchemsi, because we're hearing here in the studio from a member of Fatah. The report will be studied, it will be analyzed, it will be acted on. Has this been the experience of HRW in dealing with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas on these issues, which I know you have been doing for a number of years now?
Well, not really. I mean, we have received responses from those security agencies that we addressed in this specific report. And as I told you earlier, unfortunately, many officials from both sides used that playbook of right abusers, consisting in saying that we have a foreign agenda or whatever hidden motives behind our reporting. It happens that it's obviously not the case. I mean, we also met a high-ranking security official at the Office of the Presidency who committed to review our report thoroughly. So we have good hopes that we will hear back on more specific cases rather than just blanket denials.
Well, as you mentioned, you guys have been working on this report for about 2 years, and this is an issue that you track across Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza regularly. Have you witnessed a specific change recently? Do you see sort of parallels between political situations of the Palestinian Authority, for example, and clamp down on dissent?
Well, yes. As the rift or the dispute has deepened between Hamas and Fatah, we have seen more of these cases. I mean, very recently, at the end of the month of September, in the span of a very few days, there have been more than 50 arrests of Fatah sympathizers in Gaza and vice versa. I think a little more than 60. So yes, it unfortunately increased in the past years, even as the dispute between the both authorities was getting like deeper.
Ahmed, again, the situation, the Palestinian Authority has complained about the abuses that they say have taken place in the Gaza Strip from Hamas. So clearly, at least you do concede within the Gaza Strip, these kind of abuses are taking place.
I can say yes. In Gaza, there are no real authority. It's organizations ruling the Gaza Strip, and we are trying to continue the reconciliation process and to return back to govern Gaza. I believe that Hamas is not acting according to the law there, while the Palestinian Authority acting according to the Palestinian law in general. We need to work hard in public to convince the leaders of Hamas to stop acting against free of speech and against journalists.